In this video, we're going to utilize the massive modulation features to create a long riser sound, really common in electronic dance music. It kind of signifies the start of the next section. And the great thing about setting up modulation is very often a type of sound really is just the modulation. And once you get the modulation configured, then you can have a huge variety of different possible sounds just by manipulating small parameters throughout your synthesizer. So, I find that the setting up the modulation tends to be the hard, maybe tedious or knowledgeable part, and then playing with it later is really the fun sound design part. So the hope here is that we can set up a really good kind of modulation template for ourselves, and then you can experiment and create a huge variety of different risers and noise sweep sounds based on this. So let's set up a basic riser modulation, and then we'll look at some possible variations to it. I'm starting with the init patch or basic new sound in massive by going to File and New Sound. And if I play up and down the keyboard, we just get a basic synthesizer wave shape. Now my goal is to have this sound start at a low pitch and slowly rise up and be perfectly synchronized to 8 measures, and to always be perfectly synced to the global DAW. I'd also like to be able to play rhythmically on my keyboard and have that rising still going so I can make a rhythmic riser just by playing on the keyboard. So it's a lot to set up. Let's see if we can do it right here. The first thing we need to do is make sure our audio routing is how we want it to be. And all I want to hear is one oscillator going through filter 1. So I'll take the filter 1 to blend and put it all the way to filter 1. And then after filter 1, I just want to hear the output of that single filter. So I'll take my mix 1, mix 2 parameter and put that all the way to the top. I've configured the sound path, and now it's time to configure some of the modulation or control signals. And what we're going to use is LFO 5. And I'm using LFO 5 because it's nice to have your modulators in the same order that the signal path is. So I'm using an early modulator to go at the beginning of the signal path. I might use the LFO 8 here to go at the end of the signal path, maybe the amplifier later. So I need to define LFO 5 as a modulation source. So I'll click on the crosshair. We have that floating 5. I want to define pitch of oscillator 1 as my destination. I'll drag and drop. And then I want to go over a very large range. So it's a really dramatic riser. So I'll click and drag up to get a nice range. Now I'll try playing a key and see what we get. Alright, so some of this patch is right. I have a very large vibrato, right? I have a frequency modulation over a huge range. The shape is wrong and the speed is wrong, but I have the modulation configured. The next thing I'd like to do is have this synchronized to my tempo. And to do that, we go to the LFO section and choose the sync button right there. Now instead of having the frequency of the LFO defined in hertz, we have it defined in a metric unit. This is a multiplier and this is a subdivision. 1 is standing for 1 measure, so this now has a rate of 1 measure, meaning it will go through this entire shape in a single measure. If I wanted to go over 4 measures, I could increase this to 4, and now this will go over 4 measures. And if I hit a key now, we have a much slower modulation, and that would go over exactly 4 measures. Now the shape isn't quite right. I want this to rise over 4 measures, right? I don't want it to have this kind of funky shape. So I'll use the ramp parameter, and now let's try it. And while that's good, it is synchronized to 4 measures, it's a descender, not a riser. So I need to figure out how to take this ramp shape, but make it rise instead of descend. And that's quite easy. We just need to use a negative modulation instead of a positive modulation. And we do that by going to our modulation destination and clicking and dragging down until we have a negative modulation. Again, I'll do this over a fairly wide range. And now I'll click and I'll play a key and see what it sounds like. And we're getting somewhere, right? Now, let's try this in time with our music. We're going to start at the next measure. Perfect. Perfectly in time with our music because we're synchronized to the global tempo. Excellent. Now the next thing we might want to do is be able to play this rhythmically. So I could keep tapping and the rise would keep going, but I could play a rhythm during that rise. Let's see what happens right now. Every time I hit a key, it's starting at the beginning of the LFO shape here. And I would like this to be what we might call a free running LFO, or we want to turn restart off so that as we hit a key, it does not restart the LFO every time. If I turn restart off, we get a very different sound when I play multiple notes. Perfect. Let's hear it in time with the music. Start now. Perfect. So it's right in time with the music, and no matter when I play, it's going to be perfectly in sync with my music. Now, because we have position on, this will also synchronize to 4-bar chunks throughout our music. So no matter where you are in the music, it's always going to start every 4 measures, and it's going to end at every other 4 measures. So this will work perfectly if you divide your music up into 4-bar segments, which is the musical standard. So we have to have position on and synchronous on, a downward ramp, and negative modulation. This is a great setup for modulation, and once we have this, we really can do a variety of things. So let's see some of the possible variations on this idea. First off, I could synchronize it to 8 measures instead of 4, right? So it'll be a very slow ramp. Let's hear. Start my groove. Right at the end of 8 measures. And it goes down. So perfectly synchronicity, and we can change the length of that as much as we want. Now, one thing that can be quite nice is to manipulate the kind of curvature of that ramp. And that's where the X-fade curve parameter really can come in handy. We can set up 2 different shapes for the LFO and morph between them. So if I was to choose something, let's try one like expo down 4, like that, right? Now, if I go this way, the curvature is going to be very different than if I come up here. We'll get a linear ramp here and a different shaped ramp here, and it's morphing between them. So now I'll try this. And let's try it. I like to set up these risers with a pretty a pretty fast rise at first, and then just increase the length later when I'm ready to put it in my song. So let's hear this. So it kind of jumps up quickly in the beginning. If I come up here, we have a linear ramp. So we can even modulate that in time. So that's a great way to manipulate the shape of that ramp to really fine tune it over your music. Linear works pretty well. I like a little bit of this one in there too. And you can try some of the other ones if you like. Like you can even get crazier with the shape and experiment with different types of wobbly kind of risers, which can really be quite fun. But I'll go back to the expo down to here and just put a little bit right there. Now, one of the great things about this sound is it doesn't have to be just the oscillator pitch, right? We can also use this to create a noise sweep of sorts. So let's try this. I'm going to turn off my oscillator and enable the noise. I'm going to turn color all the way up and amplitude all the way up, and like the first oscillator, I'm going to route it to filter 1. And now I'll try this. We just get a bunch of noise, but we're going to bring in a new filter. And the best thing for a noise sweep is a band pass filter. So we're going to get the band pass filter, set resonance moderately, cutoff frequency, I'm going to manipulate by hand right now, and bandwidth will have all the way down. So I'm going to play a key and manipulate cutoff frequency. So you see we can get a nice noise sweep by manipulating that bandpass filter. I may want to get a little volume out of this, so I'll turn up my volume there. I'll turn up my master volume a bit too and try this again. Now if I want to set up a riser with this or a noise sweep with this, I would set up the modulation the same way I did to my first oscillator. I'll grab LFO 5, drop it on cutoff frequency mod slot, and click and drag down. And we'll just set our bias point right there. And now let's hear it with the music. And we'll set our ratio back up to 8 measures. Perfectly in time. That's excellent. So you see, once we have this modulation configured, we can do a huge variety of things with it. Let me just give you some other ideas. I'd like you to take it from here and just start experimenting and try to think of what are some other things that you might hear this slow ramp, this riser sound do. Some other great ideas. Use an oscillator and a filter and noise at the same time and blend them in a nice way. Have some oscillators that are going in a negative direction and some that are going in a positive direction, so you can get kind of crosswise voices as the modulation goes on. Bring in your modulation oscillator. If you modulate the phase of oscillator 1 and start changing the pitch of this, you can get some wonderful out-of-tune partials, make some really nice, almost aggressive sounding risers. A great option also is to introduce some reverb and manipulate dry-wet so that the sound starts really dry, kind of, really in your face and buzzy, and then as it gets to the top of the rise, it turns into reverb and kind of goes away in the distance. It's a beautiful thing, particularly when you're bringing kind of a breakdown section maybe. You might also consider changing resonance with your riser. I find having a higher resonance toward the bottom of the ramp and a lower resonance toward the top to be quite effective. So you see, the modulation is really the important part. After you have the modulation, you can do a variety of creative things, and really it's just up to your imagination about how complex and how interesting these risers can be.